I was born in 1863. German immigrant Lucas Glockner gave my life on 97 Orchard Street. And he created me in order to provide affordable apartments to accommodate the overwhelming inflow of immigrants in New York City, and at the same time make a profit for himself. I still remember that riot in 1863 from July 13th to July 16th. It reached the culmination of the long-standing working classes, and largely Irish, racial, political, and religious resentment of the government. Working-class Irish immigrants had suffered inflation, food shortages, and virulent discrimination and unemployment at that time. I thought that was why I was built. In that specific period, I started to accommodate more and more immigrants, trying to provide them a warm and safe home, releasing the pressure of being immigrants at that time. And when I was firstly opened, I got 22 families and 2 storefronts. However, the good times didn't last long. If I remembered well, all of the following management began from 1864. New Yorkers formed a civilians association and a subcommittee called the Council of Hygiene and Public Health to improve the overall living standard of the area. And then in 1867 and 1879, successive housing regulations and legislations were enforced. And at that time, I started to realize that my ability is limited, at least in providing a comfortable living condition for the residents. All of these housing regulations and legislations were aimed at improving living standard, such as arranging windows in a way that allows natural light to get in the rooms and so on. Obviously, my indicators were not qualified, or in other words, most of my indicators cannot meet the current life needs of these immigrants. Soon after the publication of the laws, many measures were applied. According to the law published in 1867, buildings are required to have fire escapes, and at least 1 toilet for every 20 tenants, and to be connected to the city sewers if possible. However, many tenement owners did not follow the law, so it had little effect. Then it came the Tenement House Act of 1879, also known as the Old Law, and was followed by the 1867 law. Many buildings were outlawing the construction of buildings like me, that had interior rooms without windows. The 1879 law required all rooms to be open onto the street, the rear yard, or an air shaft, for the tenant to escape the building in an emergency. This led owners to the development of the dumbbell tenement plan. After that, it came the Third Tenement House Act, which was called the Tenement House Act of 1901, also known as the New Law. The government noticed that many of the tenement buildings were extremely dangerous and unlivable. The 1901 law required buildings to include running water, gas, light, and ventilation. The dumbbell tenement plan was outlawed. Since the previous Tenement House Act had not helped change the housing conditions, the law allowed the Tenement House Department to inspect these buildings and enforce the new regulations. In 1935, I was forced to be closed down. Rather than continuing to modify me, the landlord evicted the residents, boarded the upper windows, and sealed the upper floors, leaving only my stoop level and basement storefronts open for business. Through the span of more than 70 years, I was home to approximately 7,000 immigrants, seeing the women inside stitching and staying up making dresses, struggling for life, their children leaving early and returning late to work outside for a better living standard. Some of the families with 5 or more family members huddling together in a rather small room at no choice. Although I provided a dwelling for these immigrants, I cannot improve their living standard or change their social status fundamentally. Many years later, a historian and political activist named Ruth J. Abram and her colleague Anita Jacobson came across witnessing that I was deserted and worn out at that time, and they thought that I was a perfect venue for preserving and honoring the immigrant experience by transforming me into a museum. Following their vision of establishing a house museum that would examine the lives of typical immigrants, Abram and Jacobson began the process of restoring my apartments as well as my facade, striving to create the most realistic reconstruction of the immigrant scene that occupied the place decades ago. Nowadays I play a role in telling the story of American immigration through personal stories that reveal how immigration has helped shape the nation's culture, economy, and society in America's iconic immigrant neighborhood, Lower East Side of New York City. I reveal the stories of nearly 20,000 people who lived in tenement buildings on Orchard Street in the late 19th century through the 1970s. Originally constructed as a row of 3 old law tenements in 1888, I am, in particular, a survivor. Through multiple cycles of boom and bust, I bear the accumulated traces of more than 100 years of major alterations and heavy use. I was originally built in response to the great wave of immigration in the late 19th century, and I have been continuously adapted to changing urban and economic conditions by a long succession of owners and commercial tenants. The latest design continues this tradition of urban regeneration in a most authentic way. Celebrating humanity through the immigrant experience, I corroborate the grand experiment that is America through architecture and examines the role that history and museums can play in human beings' lives.